Close your eyes. Let your body sink into stillness. Tonight, we travel back to feudal Japan, to a world of mist-covered mountains, silent temples, and warriors who believed that dying well was the highest achievement a man could reach. You've heard of Bushido, the way of the warrior.
Loyalty, sacrifice.
But what if I told you that Bushido, as most people understand it today, was never really what it claimed to be? What if the code that shaped an entire civilization was built, at least in part, on myth? Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we're going to gently unravel one of history's most beautiful and most dangerous illusions. The word Bushido means, quite simply, the way of the warrior. Bushi warrior. Due path, or way. For generations, this code has been celebrated in movies, books, martial arts schools, and philosophy classes across the Western world. It promised a system of ethics so pure, so complete, that it seemed almost too good to be true. And as it turns out, in many ways, it was. Let your breath slow down. In and out. The version of Bushido that most Americans encounter today, the one that talks about loyalty unto death, about dying with honor, about the samurai as a kind of living saint. This version was largely constructed in the late 19th and early 20th century. Not by ancient samurai sitting in mountain monasteries, but by Japanese intellectuals, politicians, and nationalists, people who needed a powerful cultural story to serve a very specific purpose. Before we examine the trap, we need to understand the real samurai stripped of Hollywood polish. The samurai emerged in Japan around the 8th and 9th centuries. They were, at their core, professional soldiers. Men and occasionally women hired to protect the lands and interests of powerful lords, known as daimyo. Let the tension leave your hands. Your fingers. Let everything go soft. The early samurai were practical above all else. They rode horses, carried bows, and later mastered the sword. They were dangerous men living in dangerous times, and their ethics were shaped not by spiritual poetry, but by survival. Yes, they had codes of conduct. All professional military classes do. But these codes shifted dramatically across centuries, between clans, between regions. There was no single, unified Bushido that every samurai lived and died by. In reality, samurai betrayed their lords sometimes for money, sometimes for power, sometimes simply to stay alive. They switched sides during wars. They negotiated, retreated, and calculated just like soldiers in every culture across human history. The romanticized samurai, the stoic, death-embracing warrior philosopher, is far more legend than fact. So where did the polished version come from? In 1900, a Japanese scholar named Nitobe Inazo published a book called Bushido, The Soul of Japan. He wrote it in English, not for Japanese readers, but for Western audiences, for Americans and Europeans who were fascinated by Japan's rapid modernization and its military victories. People who wanted to understand what made the Japanese tick. Let your eyelids grow heavy. There is nowhere to be tonight. Nothing to do. Just listen. Nitobe's Bushido described 7 core virtues: righteousness, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. He compared samurai ethics to European chivalry, to Stoic philosophy, to Christian values. He made Bushido accessible and deeply appealing to Western readers. The book became enormously influential. Theodore Roosevelt reportedly loved it and distributed copies to his friends. It was read across Europe and America. But here's the critical detail that most people miss. Nitobe was describing an idealized system, part reconstruction, part invention, and part genuine tradition. He was painting a portrait of what Japanese warrior ethics could mean and, crucially, what Japanese leaders wanted the world to believe about Japan. This is where the story takes a darker turn. As Japan entered the early 20th century, its government was building something ambitious and terrifying: a modern military empire. To sustain that empire, they needed something every great military machine needs: soldiers willing to die without hesitation. Breathe in slowly, hold for just a moment, and release. The mythologized Bushido became the perfect instrument. In Japanese schools, children were taught that dying for the emperor was the supreme fulfillment of the warrior's path. That to surrender was shameful, not just personally, but cosmically. That a true warrior embraced death with a smile. This was not philosophy. This was state conditioning. The concept of seppuku, ritual suicide to preserve honor, had existed in earlier periods, but it was relatively rare and governed by strict social protocols. Under militarist Japan, the idea of dying rather than surrendering was transformed into mass expectation. The result: soldiers who fought to their last breath in conditions that any rational military strategy would have called for retreat. Officers who died rather than face capture. And most devastating of all, the kamikaze pilots. Young men, many of them teenagers, who flew planes loaded with explosives directly into Allied warships. They died believing they were fulfilling the highest calling of Bushido. The trap had fully closed. Here is something worth sitting with tonight. The samurai class in Japan was officially abolished in 1873, nearly 30 years before Nitobe published his famous book. Let that sink in as your body grows heavier and heavier against your mattress. The people who actually practiced the warrior traditions of feudal Japan never wrote a unified Bushido code. The philosophical documents that Nitobe and others drew from texts, like the Hagakure, written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 1700s, were themselves written after the great age of samurai warfare had already ended. Fixed Chernobyl. The Hagakure's most famous line, often translated as the way of the samurai is found in death, was written by a man who had never fought in a major battle. Tsunetomo was a former attendant to a lord who had died. He was describing a world already fading from memory. In other words, the iconic philosophy of the warrior was written, preserved, and promoted largely by people who were not warriors or who lived long after the era of active warfare had passed. This is not unusual in history. Many warrior codes become most refined and most romanticized precisely when they are no longer needed for actual fighting. Feudal. Now in this matters, none of this means that Bushido was pure fabrication. or that there is no wisdom worth preserving. Let's be clear about what was genuine. The emphasis on discipline, on mastering one's body and mind through relentless practice. This was real. The great swordsmen of Japan trained with extraordinary dedication. Men like Miyamoto Musashi did develop genuine philosophical frameworks about awareness, timing, and inner stillness that remain valuable today. Let your mind drift toward stillness, like a pond at midnight. Perfectly flat, perfectly quiet. The aesthetic of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in impermanence, was woven into samurai culture in genuine ways. The tea ceremony, the practice of Zen meditation, the appreciation of nature's transience, captured in the falling of cherry blossoms. These were not myths. These were real cultural practices that shaped how warriors, and eventually all of Japanese society, understood the relationship between life, death, and beauty. And the emphasis on self-accountability, on not making excuses, on taking responsibility for one's actions, this too carries genuine weight across the centuries. The trap was not in these values themselves. The trap was in what happened when those values were weaponized. When discipline became blind obedience. When honor became an instrument of shame used to control. When loyalty meant devotion, not to a principle, but to a political agenda dressed up as a spiritual calling. There is something worth asking here quietly as you drift toward sleep. Why did the West fall so completely in love with Bushido? Why do American martial arts schools, self-help books, leadership seminars, and motivational posters still invoke samurai imagery so heavily? Part of the answer is that the story is genuinely beautiful. There is something deeply appealing about the image of a warrior who has made peace with mortality. In a culture that often struggles to acknowledge death at all, that hides it behind euphemisms and medical technology and closed caskets, the idea of a person who looks at death calmly and says, "I am ready," feels almost miraculous. Your breathing is slower now. Your thoughts are softer. Part of the answer is also that Nitobe was a brilliant communicator. He gave Western readers exactly what they wanted: a window into an exotic, ancient wisdom tradition that somehow confirmed many of the values they already held. Courage, loyalty,
honor, sacrifice.
And part of the answer is simply that myths are more compelling than history. The samurai of legend is more interesting than the actual samurai who worried about money, argued with their neighbors, sometimes drank too much, and occasionally betrayed the very lords they swore to serve. This is true of almost every warrior tradition across cultures. The Viking of legend, the Spartan of legend, the medieval knight of legend. Reality is messier, more human, more complicated. So where does this leave us? As you sink deeper into rest, consider this gently. The lesson of Bushido, the real lesson, buried beneath the mythology and the political manipulation. Maybe this any value system, no matter how beautiful, can be turned into a weapon. Loyalty becomes blind obedience. Courage becomes recklessness. Honor becomes a cage. The question is not whether a code of ethics is noble in its description. The question is always, who benefits from this code? And who pays the price? The young kamikaze pilots who died in the final years of World War II did not die because Bushido was true. They died because Bushido had been twisted, reshaped by people who held power over them into something that served the state rather than the individual. This is not unique to Japan. It is one of the oldest stories in human civilization. And the antidote, if there is one, is perhaps the very thing genuine Zen practice and genuine martial philosophy have always pointed toward self-knowledge. The capacity to look clearly at what you believe, to ask why you believe it, and to hold even your most sacred values up to honest examination. A warrior who cannot question is not enlightened. He is simply controlled. The mountains of feudal Japan are quiet now. The samurai who walked those misty roads, the real ones, complicated and human, are long gone. What remains is a story. A story that has been told and retold, shaped and reshaped by hundreds of different hands across hundreds of years. There is wisdom in that story. Real wisdom, worth carrying. But wisdom only serves us when we hold it with open hands, not as a chain, but as a lantern. Let your body rest completely now. Every muscle, every thought. You have traveled far tonight through legend and history, through myth and reality. And now there is nothing left to carry. Just this breath, and the next, and the slow, gentle tide of sleep carrying you home.